Welcome, we're group 7 from section 1, and this is our third lab practice, and it's about bakery dough and its rheological properties. The content of this practice has been divided in several sections, which are introduction, methodology, results, discussion, and conclusions. In this introduction, we will talk about bread and how its components can alter its rheological properties. For starters, it is important to say that the basic recipe for bread includes flour, water, yeast, oil, salt, and sugar. Each of the ingredients mentioned before can alter the final rheological properties of the dough and the baked bread. For example, yeast is a microorganism by which fermentation produces CO2, crucial for the creation of air bubbles in the dough and adding porosity to the final product. It is important to add sugar too to promote this process. Wheat flour is another crucial ingredient to make bread. It comes from wheat, which is a cereal with three principal parts: the germ, the endosperm, and the bran. In wheat, we can find different components such as carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. The carbohydrates that can be found in wheat are cellulose, hemicellulose, and starch. Starch is a polysaccharide found in the endosperm of the grain, and it's composed by amylose and amylopectin. Here we can find some differences between amylose and amylopectin. The first one is its structure. Amylose is a linear polymer of glucose, and amylopectin is a branch polymer. Amylose makes up from 15 up to 30% of the starch, and amylopectin makes up from 70 to 80% of the starch. Thanks to the amylose, starch gelatinization can occur, which is a process of swelling and rupture of starch granules and the breakage of intermolecular bonds between starch molecules allow hydrogen bonds to interact with more water molecules. So swelling begins. When a rapid cooling occurs, the linear amylose change become associated with hydrogen bonds and they solidify and form a gel. Here we can see the process where it starts by swelling the granule, then a maximum viscosity is found when the amylose starts to leave the granule, and then complete gelatinization occurs, and when it starts to cool down, it's called aging. If the gelatinized starch starts to cool slowly, the linear amylose chains precipitate, and this is called retrogradation. This is a chemical reaction that takes place when the amylose and the amylopectin realign. Gluten proteins are a family of starch proteins obtained from the grains of wheat and are composed of gliadin fraction and glutenin fraction. Gliadin is soluble in alcohol water and has monomer structures with intermolecular disulfide bonds. On the other hand, the glutenin is insoluble in ethanol and generates intermolecular disulfide bonds. The covalent bonds and non-covalent, namely hydronic, ionic, and hydrophilic bonds, are crucial to gluten function. With the information mentioned before, the objective of this lab practice was to analyze the effect of fermentation time on the rheological properties of bakery dough. In order to meet our goal, we followed the following methodology. For our dough, a mountain of 200 grams of wheat flour was made, in which center 108 milliliters of water at 25 Celsius were added, with also 5 grams of salt and 13 milliliters of olive oil. In a separate beaker, yeast, 3.5 grams of yeast and 65 milliliters of water at 25 Celsius were added and mixed. And finally, a little piece of the first dough was taken out in order to analyze its rheological properties before the yeast was added. And the rest of the dough was mixed with the yeast and water, and it was kneaded for around 10 minutes. Here we can see some pictures of the process where we started to knead the water with the with flour, then the adding of water to the yeast, then the mixing of all the ingredients, and finally the baked product. To analyze the rheological properties of the dough without yeast, the dough with yeast, and the baked dough, we use the texturometer. First, we turned on the texturometer, we ensembled the cell of 5 kilograms, then the software was opened, which is called exponent. Then it was selected bakery, biscuit dough, and load project. Then the accessory of 10 millimeter cylinder was placed. Then the height was calibrated, and we used the test type B1010 millimeters. And then we selected run test with a distance of 45 millimeters. And then it was run and we could obtain the results.
Now we will present the results. First, we have the time versus force graphs for the dough with yeast and without yeast on the first day. It can be seen that the force applied grows as a function of time, and for the dough without yeast, the force is much greater compared to the dough with yeast. Next, we have the time versus force graphs for the dough with yeast and without yeast on the second day. As before, it can be seen that the applied force grows as a function of time, and for the dough without yeast, the force is greater. However, compared to the force applied on day 1, we can see a decrease. Here we can see the time versus force graphs for the entire baked bread and a piece from the inside. Through these graphs, it is possible to observe fluctuations in the force that also increase over time. On the other hand, we can see how the force applied to the inner piece of the bread was greater. Lastly, we have the strain versus force graphs for the baked bread and a piece from the inside. Here we can see how increasing the strain to 20% produces a maximum force that is greater for the piece of bread.
Now we will move on with the analysis. It is possible to observe through the time versus force applied by the texturometer graphs how the force that the dough can resist decreases as time passes. This is shown in the fact that the average strength of the unleavened dough on the first day is equivalent to 4096.71 g-force. And on the second day, there is a decrease, since there will be an average strength value of 3705.3 g-force. This same behavior is observed in the yeast dough, as over time the dough will have a decrease in the resistance strength. With respect to the dough without yeast, it is observed that it has a greater average strength compared to the dough with the yeast. The great strength of the yeast-free dough is because before starting to knead, the flour absorbed water and the gliadin and the glutenin proteins began to change shape and began to link together. Since they were already linked, disulfide bonds were created. These are strong and stable. Already at the time of netting, the proteins align and the bonds break a little. As time goes by, as the dough is now netted, the elasticity of the gluten relaxes and the bonds begin to weaken. With respect to yeast dough, the same thing happens when flour and water are added, but when the yeast is added, this causes a growth in the dough so that it can retain carbon dioxide. The glutenin and gliadin proteins are responsible for creating the mesh that will retain the carbon dioxide formed by yeast fermentation. As time goes by, the fermentation time of the yeast increases and more carbon dioxide is formed. This causes greater elasticity and inflation in the dough. At the same time, this will result in the weakening of the bonds that had been formed previously, and in organoleptic terms, the dough will be spongier and not as hard compared to when it was just flour and water. Based on these results, this is why fermentation time, or how long a bread dough is left at room temperature, is so important. It is shown that if, for example, the dough was left at rest for 32 hours, the force to resist will be much lower. The yeast dough would already have very small values of strength to resist since fermentation will have already occurred and there will be a greater amount of ethanol and carbon dioxide generated. Meanwhile, the flour and water only dough will also have already lost a lot of strength in its bonds. With respect to the data related to already baked bread, changes can be observed when the bread is analyzed completely, including the crust, and when only a piece is analyzed. In regards to the force applied to the bread over time, an oscillatory behavior is observed. This is because the resulting air pockets that occur when baking are being considered. Each peak on the graph is a layer of the bread, and it is described how there is a greater force in the complete bread compared to just a piece without crust. In the second one, only the force is applied to what will be the baked dough after the yeast dies. The crust will be a mixture of sugars and amino acids that will give it its characteristic flavor. This causes a greater force to be applied. Regarding effort versus force, it is observed that as effort increases, force will also increase. This means that there will be a greater deformation capacity in the already baked bread as the effort increases. Finally, an analysis was carried out on the texture parameters of the dough and the already baked breads. In this case, only data on fracturability, hardness, and adhesiveness could be obtained. Fracturability is equivalent to the first peak of force that is observed in the masses. This force is the when the mass is observed to fall apart. It makes sense that the fracturability and toughness are lower in the yeast samples because the bonds were weakened, so less force is needed to cause deformation. Hardness is equivalent to the highest peak force necessary to generate a specific deformation. And finally, adhesiveness is the work necessary to overcome the force of attraction between the product to be analyzed and the contact surface. This is the area under the curve of the first negative peak. The adhesiveness of the dough on day 2 without yeast was greater. This is because there was more fermentation time and the elasticity increased. The values of cohesiveness, spreadability, gumminess, chewiness, and resilience could not be calculated.
Now we are going to talk about the proposed bread preparation to obtain more optimal results. According to the literature, the amount of ingredients necessary to make optimal bread in terms of appearance, texture, hardness, volume, flavor, smell, and moisture of the crumb is expressed as a percentage of the flour used. Taking into account that the flour corresponds to the 100%, we need to add 6.25% of sugar, 1.20% of salt, 2% of yeast, 2.7% of hydrogenated fat, and 60% of water. This way, you can ensure a proper hydrated dough that can be easily handled and it's quite elastic. On the other hand, regarding the variables in the bread preparation process, it was considered that the temperature of the water added should be between 35 and 40 degrees Celsius, considering that the average temperature in Bogota is 20 degrees Celsius and we want to have a dough with a temperature around 26 to 30 degrees Celsius, since fermentation is favorable at this temperature. Furthermore, water at this temperature ensures better hydration and gluten development, promoting cohesion, elasticity, plasticity, and tenacity of the dough. Therefore, the dough acquires an appropriate texture and viscosity that allows it to be handled correctly. Now, kneading time should be between 15 to 20 minutes, and it's advisable to do it slowly at first to mix all the components correctly, and then increase the speed to shape, stress, and oxygenate the dough. After kneading, it is recommended to leave the dough to ferment for at least 80 minutes so that it increases its volume and produces enough ethanol and organic acids to obtain a good flavor. Finally, to obtain a crispy and good colored crust, it is optimal to bake the bread at approximately 230 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes.
Finally, we will move on to the conclusions. In conclusion, it is observed that as time passes, there will be a decrease in the strength to resist in the masses. In the case of unleavened dough, this is because it is not being kneaded, so the bonds begin to relax and it is easier to cause deformation. On the other hand, yeast dough will have a large amount of carbon dioxide as the fermentation time increases, and this causes the bonds to be weakened. With respect to already baked bread, the crust will cause a greater amount of force necessary for its deformation. Finally, it was possible to create the best bread possible with the best parameters. Finally, here are the references. Thank you very much.